Greetings from CBC Studio A and another episode of Discernment Digest, where we offer a digest of news items that present questions of obvious concern for those of us holding to a biblical worldview, looking at those matters through the prism of creation, fall, and redemption. We'll do that today, and also in our second portion, at listener request, we'll begin a short series on biblical counseling. First, this week there were a few matters that fall in the categories of law and national security, both of which we Christians want to see strengthened because we believe we are in a fallen world. And that requires the protection of law and national and international security. And we are rightly alarmed when either are threatened, and we see such threats. First, in the area of law. In January, President Trump sued the Internal Revenue Service in his personal capacity as a private citizen. He sued the IRS for $10 billion because an agency contractor had leaked his tax returns in 2019. Now, it fell to the Justice Department to oppose that lawsuit. Now, just think about that for a moment. You have the sitting president suing a government agency that is under his direction, ultimately, as the chief executive of the United States, and the IRS is an executive branch agency. And then you also have the Justice Department, also an executive branch agency under the president, whose job it is to, if a private citizen, any private citizen, brings a lawsuit against a government agency, the Justice Department defends that agency. So you have the president who is over both the Justice Department and the IRS, and he has filed this lawsuit, and his Justice Department has to oppose his lawsuit. The federal judge presiding over Trump's suit has wondered whether there's a real case or controversy in the matter. And in order for someone to bring a suit, according to our Constitution, that's language, case or controversy, that's from the Constitution itself. There must be a real case or controversy. And the judge is wondering whether there is, given that he is the sitting president and his named adversaries are, as I've said, entities where decisions are subject to his direction. And so it may well be that there can't be a lawsuit in this case, and because there cannot be lawsuits brought if there aren't parties that are adverse. The judge ordered the two sides to submit briefs addressing that very issue by this coming Wednesday, the 20th, which apparently motivated Trump to think about settling the lawsuit instead, because he's probably going to lose. It's probably going to get thrown out. And that appears to be what is going to happen. The president is expected to drop his suit in exchange for the Justice Department creating a $1.7 billion with a B compensation fund for victims of the Biden administration's, quote, weaponization of government. Now, Trump would be barred from receiving money from the fund for his legal claims, but, quote, entities associated with him would not be. He would also have the power to, quote, remove members of the commission running the fund and do so without cause, and the commission would be under no obligation to disclose its procedures or decision-making process. And prime beneficiaries of this fund are expected to be the 1,600 or so people charged over the January 6, 2021 riot at our Capitol. That's a group that includes dozens who have been implicated in other crimes, including child sex offenses. If the commission wishes to, conceivably, it could divide the settlement amount equally among them. And with $1.7 billion, that would make every one of them a millionaire. There's also been talk about the IRS agreeing to drop any audits of Trump's tax returns, which are supposed to be mandatory for presidents per agency procedures. So it's another of a long list of things that are happening that can undermine the strength of our legal system and the protections afforded by it when you have an executive, no matter who it is, and no matter the party. In this case, it's Trump, and it's a Republican, but exercising this kind of authority and being able to use it to his own benefit or the benefit of his friends and supporters. So we'll need to keep an eye on that. With regard to national security, it has long been the case that President Trump has not been a friend of NATO, NATO, a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, NATO is a group of 32 nations. 30 of those are in Europe, and then you have, in addition, the United States and Canada. NATO was formed in the aftermath of World War II in 1949 as an alliance to keep another world war like that from happening. And here we are, almost 80 years later, and it has been wildly successful. Now, a few years after that, 1955, another group was started to oppose NATO, the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact was a security agreement signed, as I said, in 1955 in Poland by the Soviet Union and 6 other Central and Eastern European countries. And you had NATO and you had the Warsaw Pact countries during the next few decades in what's known historically as the Cold War, with the Soviet Union and the United States being the chief antagonists. The fall of the Soviet Union and the subsequent fall of the Warsaw Pact alliance humiliated what we now call Russia. It's no longer the Soviet Union, it's Russia. And the man who for a good 20 years now has headed up Russia, Vladimir Putin. And Putin has explicit about his desire to rebuild the Soviet empire. Vladimir Putin was a KGB, a mid-level KGB. That was their version of like the CIA. And he was a mid-level KGB agent in Dresden, Germany, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. And he has talked about how he was personally adversely affected by that, and his desire to see the Soviet Union rise again. It really does have echoes for me. It reminds me of Adolf Hitler's resentment from having served in World War I and the Treaty of Versailles that really did humiliate Germany after World War I, and Hitler's determination to build what he called the Third Reich, the Third Empire. Now, the Third Reich, the Third Empire, the first was the Holy Roman Empire that lasted for about 1,000 years. The second, the German Empire, from 1871 to the end of World War I, 1918. And then Hitler was trying to erect and build the Third Empire, the Third Reich, in the 1930s and 1940s. Now, Putin cannot succeed in his plans to rebuild the Soviet Union as long as there is a strong NATO, and therefore he is insistent that NATO not expand. For example, Ukraine has applied and made very clear that they would like to be part of NATO, to have the protections of that organization, but he has opposed it. And our own president, has been sympathetic not to Ukraine, but to Putin and Russia for reasons that are mysterious. I have my own thoughts about what that is, but on Discernment Digest, I don't offer conjecture. We just deal with facts as best we can. The fact is that our president has been sympathetic to Putin and to Russia over against Ukraine, and President Trump, has not been terribly favorable toward NATO, which has kept the West, Europe and the United States and Canada, safe for all of these decades during a nuclear age. And there's a thought process related to not supporting NATO among many conservatives today. Why should we support NATO? Why should we put money into this organization? That's over there. We're over here. America first. Let's let them take care of themselves. We have troops in Germany. We have troops in countries all over the world. And we have bases. And those troops and those bases in these other countries don't just benefit those other countries. I mean, they do, but that's not the primary reason they're there. The primary reason they're there is because it benefits us. It keeps trading lanes open, and it allows quick access for us in the event of a military outbreak that we deem necessary to get involved in other parts of the world. And yet, in addition to having NATO weakened in terms of U.S. support, we have recently, just in the last 1 to 2 weeks, withdrawn troops from Germany and from Poland. And in the case of Poland, just this past week this happened, and it did so at the behest of the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, and without notice to anybody else within his department, as far as we know. So we're withdrawing troops from places where we've had them for decades. And in terms of security, it's just a concern, because in a fallen world, we most definitely want to be as secure as possible. And then meanwhile, you also had this past week the president with an historic visit to China. And he took a very large delegation with him. He took business leaders, many business leaders, Elon Musk, for example, with him. And he met with President Xi of China. He praised President Xi over and over again. I do not understand the praise for people like Putin, people like Xi, but the president has an affinity for strong leaders, even if they are authoritarian leaders, for some reason. And so the trip was filled with that. In terms of what its objectives were and what objectives were achieved, as I record this on Sunday, the May 17th, I don't know what those are. I've tried to find out, and I do not know what those are. And that stands in contrast to another historic visit by a U.S. president to China back in 1972, the winter of 72, when Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who was his national security advisor, I think at the time, later became Secretary of State, when they visited China, and this was in just the heat of the Cold War, and our hatred really for communism and the expansion of communism. And here you had a U.S. president visiting Red China, communist China. And it was quite controversial at the time. I was 10 years old. You can do the math then for how old I am. And I remember in elementary school, we had it on television. It was that big a deal. During the school day on television, we got to watch our president arrive in what was then called Peking, now Beijing, in China. But that visit had a very clear strategy to it, and history has been very kind to Nixon and Kissinger with regard to that initiative because it was designed to weaken the Soviet Union, strengthen the United States with ties to then emerging power China. The Soviet Union was making overtures to China, but we in effect beat them to it, at least at that time. Meanwhile, President Trump, I don't know exactly what the objectives for this visit were, or as I said, what was achieved. Maybe that will come out. We do know that the president has said that he and Xi had discussed Taiwan. Now, many of you know, perhaps all of you know, that Taiwan is just off the coast of mainland China. And going back to the 1940s, that Taiwan, Formosa, as it was originally called, was an independence movement from communist China. And it's remained independent for all of these decades with the support of protection from the United States. China has always wanted to get Taiwan back under its fold, always. It is always threatening to do so. And the United States has been very stalwart in its protection of, defense of Taiwan. And so that's kept China at bay. But now the president is frankly fudging on that. And in his comments about Taiwan, he mentioned how tiny Taiwan is, how large China is, implying, or at least that's the way I understood it, implying that, of course, China would want to enfold Taiwan. And he refused to say what we would do if China moved against Taiwan. So it leaves me concerned for security reasons with regard to what will we do to protect allies, historic allies, if they are attacked by those who have been historically our foes. With regard to NATO, NATO has a charter that all of the 32 nations, of course, have signed to. And one of the articles in that NATO charter is Article 5. And Article 5 is the one that says an attack against any NATO country is an attack against all of them. Now, that's never had to be invoked, except one time, only one time. And I'll tell you what that one time was after I tell you that President Trump has made disparaging comments about NATO, saying they would never come to our aid. We're the ones always protecting them. I'm paraphrasing, but we're always the ones having to protect them. They would never come to our aid. But here's the thing. Article 5 has only been invoked one time in the history of NATO, and that was on behalf of the United States, and NATO countries came to our aid. It was after 9/11, September 11, 2001. Now, these are geopolitical issues. They are above my pay grade. All I can do is look at the facts, what has happened, threats, potential threats to things that we as Christians should care about because we live in a fallen world. But I recall back in 2012 when Mitt Romney was running against Barack Obama for the presidency, and during one of the debates during that campaign, Mitt Romney said, Russia is our number one geopolitical foe. And Obama said, you know, the 80s called and they want their foreign policy back. So he was saying, here we are in 2012. The Cold War is over. It's been over since the early 90s. We won, and here you are, Mitt Romney, talking about Russia still being our number one enemy. But the truth of the matter is, Romney was probably right about that. Russia has been supplying Iran. You know that we are at war with Iran. Russia has been supplying Iran with intelligence to help them target U.S. soldiers and munitions. This is Russia, Putin's Russia, aiding our enemy Iran, with whom we are at war right now. We're told by our president that we've won this war, but the Strait of Hormuz, as I speak, is still not open. Okay, said that I've been asked by, at listener request, to comment in this episode, and then I'll continue it in future episodes, on biblical counseling, where it developed, what it is, and any issues with which we should be aware. Now, this dovetails well with what I commented on in the last episode regarding God's will. I asked in that episode, was it God's will that Donald Trump be elected president? Many religious supporters of President Trump have said that he has been raised up by God because God says in Scripture he raises up people and he places them in positions of authority. It is God who raises up a king, and so the director of the White House Faith Office has said when you fight against the plan of God in his chosen man, you're fighting against the hand of God. And I said in that episode last time that that might seem plausible at first hearing, especially if you're a supporter of the president until you realize that, of course, that same thing applies equally to leaders like Obama and Biden. Didn't God raise them up as well? And the truth is, in the Bible, God sometimes raises up bad leaders to test and or punish his people. So is the fact that Obama was president or Biden was president or Trump is president, does the fact that these men were president indicate that that's what God wanted? To put it another way, was it God's will that Obama, Biden, and Trump be president? And I gave another example. Some years ago, a woman was telling me that her daughter had a baby out of wedlock. This was a woman I didn't know very well, so I wasn't planning to say much or really say anything, but she knew I was a pastor. I think she felt like she needed to justify it, and so she added, well, it was obviously God's will that we have this baby. So was it God's will that this woman's daughter get pregnant without being married? And the right answers to both questions about the presidents and about the daughter, the pregnancy, the answer to both are yes and no, because the Bible uses the term God's will in two different ways. In one way, the Bible speaks of God's will, then yes, Obama and Biden and Trump being president were all God's will, and the baby conceived out of wedlock was also God's will in that sense. But I said, I think you can see how if you don't differentiate between two ways that the Bible uses God's will, his sovereign will and his moral will, you could end up making excuses for sinful or foolish choices because it's all equally God's will. So if I sin, it's God's will. If I vote for someone that might promote immoral policies, it's okay because it's all God's will. You never want to use God's plan, that is his sovereign will, to excuse violations of his desire, that is his moral will. Now this introduces then the origins of the modern biblical counseling movement quite well, because it turns out that it began in the milieu of psychology and psychiatry in which human behavior was being excused, or at least perceived to be by the labels that those disciplines were applying to various behaviors. Charlie Brown and Lucy in Charlie Brown Christmas in 1965. Many of you can probably see the scene out there in the snow. She's got her kind of desk set up there. She puts the sign out, the doctor is in, 5 cents in the can in order to get her advice. And Charlie comes and says, I'm down, I'm depressed. And she says, I think we need to pinpoint your fears. If we can find out what you're afraid of, we can label it. And during this session, Lucy attempts to diagnose Charlie Brown's malaise with several psychiatric labels. Hypengiophobia, the fear of responsibility. Allurophagia, the fear of cats. Chlamydophobia, the fear of staircases. Thalassophobia, the fear of the ocean. Gephobia, the fear of crossing bridges. And then she says, oh, maybe you have pantophobia. Do you have pantophobia? He says, what is pantophobia? She says, the fear of everything. And then there's a pause and he yells, that's it. Now this was 1965. And people were beginning to tire and, as in the case of a Charlie Brown Christmas, make fun of the idea of putting a label on all human problems. A few years later, in 73, a secular psychologist, not a Christian, Carl Menninger, wrote a book with a provocative title, Whatever Became of Sin. Well, it happens that right in between those two events, the release of A Charlie Brown Christmas in 65 and Menninger's book in 73, in 1970, a man named J. Adams, a pastor, started the modern biblical counseling movement with the publication of his book, Competent to Counsel, that was motivated in part by the same thing that Charles Schulz and Carl Menninger were motivated by, getting away from artificial labeling that excuses bad behavior. Just a few years before the release of Competent to Counsel, J. Adams had, in the summer of 1965, applied to a six-week intensive fellowship program for clergy that was sponsored by the Eli Lilly Foundation and it was run by a non-Christian psychologist named Hobart Mowrer, Mowrer. Mowrer was a professor of psychology at the University of Illinois. He lived from 1907 to 1982. He's known for behavior therapy and two-stage theory, something that had a great significance in the later ministry of J. Adams. So, accepted into the program, Adams and the other 5 trainees virtually lived with Mowrer, spending their days working in therapy groups that Mowrer conducted in 2 state mental health hospitals in Illinois. That summer with Mowrer was, according to Adams, quote, eye-opening. He watched Mowrer confront his counselees about their actions, urge them to take responsibility, and not hide behind psychological labels. As Adams described it, quote, Mowrer was rough on people in the psychiatric hospital. He would tackle the impossible cases, and in groups he would go after someone relentlessly until a breakthrough occurred. Adams summarized the significant impact of his time with Mowrer. He said, I learned much during that time, and while today I certainly would not classify myself as a member of Mowrer's school, I feel that the summer program was a turning point in my thinking. Adams said much about Mowrer's influence on his thinking regarding biblical counseling. Quote, I read some of Mowrer's works, including The Crisis in Psychiatry and Religion and The New Group Therapy, which he had just published. These books astounded me. Mowrer had gone far beyond my own thinking. He was flatly challenging the very existence of institutionalized psychiatry. He stated outright that the current psychiatric dogmas were false. He said reading Mowrer's book, The Crisis in Psychiatry and Religion, was an earth-shattering experience. He said, from my protracted involvement with the inmates of the 2 mental institutions, I was convinced that most of them were there not because they were sick, but because they were sinful. I came home deeply indebted to Mowrer for indirectly driving me to a conclusion that I, as a Christian minister, should have had all along, namely, that many of the, quote, mentally ill are people who can be helped by the ministry of God's Word. Now, that last quote, in which Adams expresses his deep indebtedness to Mowrer, is found in his seminal work that I mentioned earlier, his 1970 book that's credited with starting the modern biblical counseling movement, that book called Competent to Counsel. Now, the title of that book is taken from Romans chapter 15 and verse 14, which says in the NIV, I myself am convinced, my brothers and sisters, that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with knowledge, and competent to instruct one another. And when that last phrase says competent to instruct one another, that word translated instruct is the Greek word noutheteo. And it's variously translated in English as admonish, warn, instruct, or counsel. And so that verse could be rightly given as competent to counsel one another. And notice in whom this confidence to minister the word to one another is placed by the Apostle Paul, who wrote Romans 15. It's placed in the congregation of the church at Rome, not in clergy, not in professionals, in everyday people in the church there. From this, Adams came to the conviction that counseling is better done in the church by God's people using God's Word. And so in 1968, he and John Bettler founded the Christian Counseling and Educational Foundation, CCEF, that has the motto, restoring Christ to counseling and counseling to the church. And he called the kind of counseling that CCEF would practice and promote nouthetic counseling, after that Greek word in the New Testament, noutheteo, nouthetic counseling. So in 1976, he founded the National Association of Nouthetic Counselors to train and certify pastors and laypersons to counsel in the context of the local church. Well, we will continue the history and philosophy of biblical counseling next time. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, you can send those to discern@cbctrenton.com. I hope you can listen again next Monday. In the meantime, have a great week serving and discerning.